This is chapter 14 on education. This is the second of 3 videos. This is also going to be the longest of the 3, and that's because this video is going to be focusing on the problems associated with the U.S. school system. And we're particularly going to be addressing those problems that are related to some of the inequities, the racial and class inequities that we see in larger society. So the first problem that we'll touch lightly on is just the academic performance of U.S. schools. Globally, the United States ranks behind other high-income nations in terms of academic performance, and that's across multiple subjects and grade levels. The performance of the U.S. educational system has stayed level over the last 50 years, although we first noticed this performance gap and started addressing it as an issue as late as the 80s during the Reagan administration. And since then, it has been a focus of numerous presidential administrations, and we've changed some more educational policies as a way of addressing that performance gap. But largely that gap has remained, as your book notes. Our performance has remained pretty stable. Particularly in the U.S., a lot of this is driven by the fact that our academic performance of our most socially disadvantaged students is low. And we'll talk later about how families with higher education are better able to support education. And that school-family connection does have real consequences that we see in student performance. And I always like to emphasize this isn't about who prioritizes school more, who values school more. These are actual tangible economic as well as informational social resources that families with higher incomes are just able to draw upon, that leads to their students usually having just better academic performance. And the fact that in a lot of schools, the schools themselves reflect the income of the neighborhood. This means that our schools are not necessarily always very well mixed in terms of the background of their student and therefore the performance of a lot of their students. So a lot of schools are in low income areas are primarily pulling low-income students that lack those kind of parental resources. And we see this reflected in the school performances, which vary throughout the U.S. But then if we just take it as a collective whole and compare it to other nations, we are often lacking. And so, right away, we jump into this relationship between social class and education. And I'm going to introduce some terms here that aren't in your book, but are important, I think, for understanding how social class and education are related. And those terms are inequality of condition, inequality of opportunity, inequality of outcome. So it's well known that we have inequality of condition in the United States because we have a social class system, whether you're using the 6 class model, talking about the upper middle, lower middle, working poor, or you're using some other model with more or less social classes. The fact of the matter is that people in America, households in America, have different levels of resources, and those households, of course, go on to have children. And so the children, by no fault or merit of their own, are just born into different families with different amounts of resources. And we call this inequality of condition, right? They don't start at the same place in our country. And we also know that we have inequality of outcome, skipping down to the third term. And that is the fact that people go on to have different outcomes in life. So when we look at where they end up in terms of their place in the social class structure, once again, we all aren't like crossing the finish line at the exact same time. And what we know, or what you should remember from our chapter on social class and stratification, is that oftentimes there is this cycle of poverty, that there is mobility, but there isn't necessarily a whole lot of mobility at the either end of the social economic stratification ladder, so that a lot of people who are the poorest remain poor and their children remain poor, and a lot of people that are just like filthy rich, billionaires, the top 5%, they pretty much remain filthy rich billionaires, the top 5%. And then there is some movement in those kind of middle, working, lower middle class, those kind of middle classes. um, but there is inequality of outcome, right? We all don't wind up having the same things in life. And in America, we've never strived for equal outcomes. Like, that makes us very nervous, and people start throwing around terms like, communism, and it is part of our dominant ideology that there is this emphasis on hard work, meritocracy, and individualism, and it's the idea that individual people will work hard and the best will be rewarded and valued. So how do we have that confidence in the system when we know that there's inequality of condition? How do we even, um, say that about ourselves, that we have this system based on, merit and individual worth? Well, that's because in the middle, and this is the part that is debatable, because no one really debates inequality of condition and no one really debates inequality of outcome. What is debatable is whether or not we have equality of opportunity or inequality of opportunity. Do children have the same opportunities to achieve success, or do they not have the opportunities to achieve success? Um, Public education, and your view on public education, how well public education is doing at being a pathway to mobility, is the crux of this. Because we do provide public education, some people point to that as equality of opportunity. But other people point that even though we make public education accessible to everyone, that is not sufficient, because there are a lot of inequities that exist within the public education system itself. So whether or not you look at public education as being an example of equality of opportunity, or whether or not you see it as just inequality of opportunity, just furthering inequality of condition and largely setting people up for this inequality of outcome, probably has a lot to do with, are you a functionalist, or are you taking a conflict position on education? And if, especially for conflict theorists, that question, do we all have an equal chance of receiving a quality education and going on to a higher education? For them, it's very clear that if the evidence leans towards no to that question, then the conclusion is we don't have equality of opportunity. Um, and so, you know for them, and I'll go more into the theoretical frameworks in video 3, but just to kind of introduce a lot of these problems that we're now going to talk about, because almost all of them, the researchers who study and test them, a lot of them, and the evidence and data that's been generated by those researchers, a lot of them reflect the conflict theory, the conflict framework, which is that education reproduces rather than reduces social stratification. And that it's set up that the discovery of talent, instead of it being like, a free for all where we can find super talented, deserving individuals in all walks of life, instead, it's much more limited, with people that come from higher end backgrounds being better situated and able to take advantage of resources, and then call it merit, than people who are not from those backgrounds. And the focus being that low-income children, and particularly as well as minority children, and oftentimes, of course, those two go hand in hand, but not always. They uh, lack equal access to education opportunities. So it's not that they lack access, but it's a equal access. And as we'll talk about in terms of those educational opportunities, is also, what is the quality of those, and is that equal as well? And that oftentimes, as they get older, or even before they're even really that old, they start to display lowered ambitions, because it's it's reinforced by the fact that they are being provided these inferior opportunities. They are perhaps being labeled. They are experiencing discrimination, and all of this leads to kind of a detachment from education. So the aspirations aren't as high. But even when the aspirations are there and the abilities are there, the structures themselves are not necessarily set up to help these students get ahead, or to get ahead as easily or as smoothly as people who are coming from a more resource rich background. And this, what you see here, is a little graphic depiction based on data that comes from the National Longitudinal Study of Youth, that looked at test scores and students' backgrounds. And, pretty much saw that, if you have high test scores and you come from the top quintile, the likelihood that you are going to go on to college within the next 2 years after you graduate from high school is pretty much perfect. It's 90%. But if you're poor and you come from the lowest quintile with those same type of test scores, it's 50%. It's like a coin toss. Which of course is just really troubling, because that does suggest that, unlike what we would like to believe about merit, is that there are people in society who their potential remains untapped. And those people are more likely to come from economically disadvantaged backgrounds than not. Uh, of course, another way in which we can really kind of point at the inequalities of the educational system is to talk about racial segregation and racial resegregation in America. So to address this topic, we'll do a little bit of history, some of which should sound familiar from back when we talked about race and ethnicity in the past. And then we will end with a discussion about how schools are resegregating along racial lines and why. So we know that there are the racial distinctions in education completed, with whites and Asian Americans being much more likely to have some college or college BA or higher than African Americans and Latinos and Native Americans. You can see that reflected in the statistics. And of course, Asian Americans are even higher than whites, because of the number of Asian Americans who enter into America specifically for educational opportunities. So they come on higher ed student visas. So particularly for Native Americans, African Americans, and Latinos, we're going to delve into maybe some of the historical context behind these numbers. So it's worth just kind of reminding you that education was one of the primary ways that white Americans anglicized Native Americans after the Relocation Act. They built these, what were called Indian boarding schools. And in these schools, Native American children were taught that their culture was evil and uncivilized. They were forced to give up their native dress, cut their hair, their language, their spiritual beliefs. If they resisted, children were punished very harshly. Many were abused, some were even killed. And I think people are oftentimes, if they're even aware that such schools existed, They are not aware at how long these schools persisted, because it wasn't until the civil rights era, the 60s and the 70s, that Native Americans really began to regain control of their children's education. At this point, reservation schooling, so schools run by the reservations themselves, became ascendant. The first of the Native American controlled schools was created around 1966, and by the time we get into the late 1970s, pretty much all of the reservation schools were under Native American control. The problem there, and what you may remember, is that reservations are oftentimes extremely poor places, and even with the government funding that they receive, of course, I'm getting like text messages in the middle of my video. Um, where was I? This is not going to be the best video. Um, there were still like persistent funding issues, right? Because they just did not have the money to um, to be able to kind of make up for the gap in resources. So to this day, what we see on a lot of these kind of boarding schools is a lot of the problems that we see in a lot of our underfunded schools in other parts of the country as well. Just issues with dropouts, issues with academic performance, issues with violence, substance abuse, issues. So that is kind of the legacy of these Indian boarding schools. For African Americans, it was really almost the opposite, because while American Indians were forced to conform to white society during that time period, African Americans were pretty much forcefully being excluded from it. In slavery, it was prohibited for Blacks to read and write, and it came with very strict punishments, not just for the slave, but for the person who was doing the teaching, even if they were white. After slavery ended in the 1860s, we had the Reconstruction period. And during this time, the first schools for African Americans were opened. These schools were first operated by white women from the North, but then later, after they had formed training school and training programs, they educated African Americans, and they were the ones that operated these schools. These schools were really popular, and a lot of families prioritized their children attending. However, Reconstruction era was brief. It was only 10 years. And after that, public education for African Americans was much more limited in scope and poor quality in most areas. And this is because after Reconstruction, we had the Jim Crow era, where the South pretty much legalized segregation. 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson, a Supreme Court case decision, upheld states' rights to separate but equal. So in the South, everything, including schools, was segregated by law. In the North, schools were segregated, but a lot of that was because of where they lived. People lived in segregated areas. And so this residential segregation more or less also resulted in segregated schools as well. That's the difference between what we call de jure segregation versus de facto segregation. As we enter into the World War II, post-World War II era, there began to be some legal challenges to the status quo during this civil rights movement. And of course, the one that we always lift up is Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. And this was the case of Linda Brown in Topeka, Kansas. And it was her case that became responsible for ending legal segregation, de jure segregation in schools. It was decided that separate but equal, like there was no way that that could really work, because they showed by separating things, you are inherently declaring them unequal. And this had a very negative impact on kids, both Black and white. And psychologists, the Clarks, they use doll studies as evidence of this kind of negative psychological impact. And I give you a YouTube link if you want to see a more contemporary version of the doll study. So the Supreme Court decided that schools desegregation needed to occur, but they said it needed to occur with all deliberate speed, which wasn't really clear. They didn't really specify what that meant. And so obviously, a lot of places in the South resisted and stalled, and they mounted a backlash against desegregation. We saw the revival of the KKK, and this is also the time period where the Confederate flag, which largely had gone out of use post-Civil War, was then remarketed and rebranded during this time period. Um, in order to prevent uh, desegregation from occurring, there was violence. Several different school systems, like what you see here with the Little Rock Nine, they had to be desegregated with an armed military escort. In some cases, schools just closed, because if they had to desegregate their public schools, some counties just decided, well, we just won't have public school at all, and they created private schools, which we which were referred to as SEG academies, which white students paid to go to for white students who couldn't pay. In some cases, they were provided funds or vouchers in order to attend for free. But in some cases, poor white students oftentimes just were also denied an education, because they did not have the money to attend these private SEG academies. And of course, if you were African American and you lived in this area, you were cut off. So eventually, some areas faster than others, schools did desegregate. And for this to happen, uh, what wound up being a tactic that was employed was the use of busing, because people oftentimes lived in segregated neighborhoods, and so schools remained segregated, just de facto. And so busing, a court-ordered program that transported public school students to schools outside of their neighborhood, was necessary in order to end what's called de facto segregation, where the segregation is occurring not by law, but because of these residential patterns. And so you can see that the percentage of Blacks in majority white schools dramatically increased during those busing years, in the mid 70s, 80s, 90s, and then it started to dramatically decline. Um, and we'll talk about kind of, why that decline happened later. But, just this is just some visuals to kind of support several of the issues that I've kind of mentioned. And it's worth noting that when busing was used to end de facto segregation, this also occurred in states, northern states, Midwestern states, areas outside of the South. And a lot of the same things that had happened in the South, the protests, the resistance, the pushback, white flight, and the creation of SEG academies, they also happened in these northern and Midwestern states as well. So before we talk about kind of, why we have entered into a period of resegregation, let me just quickly address the question, were Hispanic and Asian children segregated as well? Although that segregation was not as consistent as African American segregation, Latinos, particularly Mexican Americans, were frequently segregated and went to segregated school systems, particularly in states where there was a high Hispanic presence, like Texas and California. One of the earliest cases that dealt with school segregation came out of San Diego County in the 1930s, and it was in an area called Lemon Grove, and it was referred to as the Lemon Grove incident. Um, And at the time, it wound up being decided in the Mexican Americans' favor that they could not be segregated against because uh, Latino was an ethnicity and not a race. And so they said that it was prohibited under the 14th Amendment. And so that decision left racial segregation in place, but indicated that ethnic segregation was wrong. Similarly, about a decade after that, in 1947, there was a Supreme Court case, Mendez versus Westminster, that was very similar, just in another part of Orange County, California. And it came to that same decision, that you could not segregate on the basis of ethnicity. And they had decided that that is what Mexican was, an ethnicity and not a race. It's worth noting that when Brown versus Board happened, they were building upon that decision that had been made in uh, Mendez versus Westminster. Another kind of point to make about in the history of Latino students in education is that during the 70s, there was a major movement of young people in the school systems, what we now call the Chicano blowouts. And this was a movement where they were pushing back against their treatment in a lot of the Los Angeles city schools, that they were often unfairly punished, that they did not receive a quality education, that their history wasn't being taught. And one of the positives that came out of the Chicano blowouts and the activism that these young people displayed, one of those positives was the fact that this led to the teaching of ethnic studies, and the inclusion of ethnic studies in a lot more schools' curriculum, not just in California, but in other states as well. Now, for Asian students, they also had a very significant Supreme Court win in the 1970s, Lau versus Nichols, and this was significant not just for these students, but also because it set a basis for um, for ESL language programs, and and kind of set a tone for how you need to approach students where English is not their first language. So Lau versus Nichols was a case that took place after the California school system was fully integrated. Um, Once again, they also relied on busing to make that happen. But they had Chinese students who did not speak English. And while some of these students were enrolled in classes in English, a lot of them were not. They were pretty much just placed in a room and not provided any instruction at all for the entire class day. And so they uh, basically sued the school system, San Francisco United School District, for not receiving meaningful instruction. And the Supreme Court ended up overturning the ruling from the lower court that did not decide in their favor. The Supreme Court says that a meaningful education is guaranteed for all students. And that decision, where they use the language of meaningful education, has later come into play when we speak about, how do we educate students where English is not their first language, as well as how do we educate students that have specific, educational, physical, disabilities. That the idea that students deserve a meaningful education, and schools have to provide that. And we owe that to the Lau versus Nichols case. And so that kind of, like I said, was the first time that we really had clear kind of direction on, how do we approach, this increased diversity in our schools, because it wasn't just California. In the 70s and the 80s and through today, we've had increasing diversity, and some of that diversity is from immigrants. Your book notes that 1 million immigrants enter the U.S. annually, and those immigrants oftentimes have families, bring families with them, and many of whom English is not their first language, for some of whom they do not speak English at all. And so, by that Supreme Court dictate that we have to provide a meaningful education, we set up programs. And your book notes that there is this debate about, what is the best way to do this. You have some schools that point to English immersion programs as being the best. And that's the policy of teaching non-English speakers in English, right? The fact that if the more that they hear it, the faster they'll grasp it, the sooner it'll make sense. There's an argument that they're being kind of more readily embraced and accepted in the kind of social fabric of the school if they aren't in separate classes. But then there are people that instead make a strong argument for bilingual education, and that's the policy of offering most of the classes in the students' native language while also teaching them English. And that, being bilingual definitely has, overall cognitive development, and it also encourages acceptance. So, there are some pros and cons of both types of programs, but for schools, um, certainly schools that haven't traditionally had a lot of immigrants or immigrant presence, as these schools have perhaps become more diverse and have had immigrants move in their area, this is something that administrators often have to address in their curriculum if it has not been, to make sure that it's not overlooked. And while we're on the topic of immigration, before I leave it behind, certainly one thing that does impact the academic performance of these schools that have a lot of immigrants, particularly undocumented immigrants in their school, one thing that impacts the academic performance as well as the likelihood that they remain in school and don't drop out is, what are the policies in place in that state for undocumented students? Um, Even though President Obama, kind of created uh, that DACA program and gave that DACA status. And DACA uh, just stands for Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. So that speaks to, children that came into America at a young age with their families, without documentation, that there are kind of a separate set of rules and stipulations, um, in terms of allowing them to remain in the United States and participate in schools and the workforce, even without that documentation. This is not. This is stopgap legislation, right? It's no real policy has been put in place. It didn't happen during Obama's time. It hasn't happened under the first administration of Trump. So these young people, some of whom, of course, are now not that young, they're in their 20s and their 30s, they kind of have a very unclear place in society. Now, what does this mean as a high school student? Well, whether or not you aspire to college, go on to college, remain in high school, we know is at least somewhat related to what you expect to happen after you graduate from high school. And because the DACA could not require individual states to adopt policies in their universities and in their states about how to specifically to address these individuals, this map just shows you that all states do things differently. There are some states that offer in-state tuition and allow financial aid for undocumented students. There's other states that allow them to have in-state tuition, but they don't provide them financial aid. There's some states where it varies by the institution in the state. Um, in some states, it prohibits them from paying in-state tuition, but in some cases, DACA can sometimes work with the institution to get them in and receive some type of tuition remission. And then there are a few states, the ones in the red, that prohibited undocumented students from attending at all. Although once again, sometimes DACA is able to get some students enroll in those institutions. But if you're not a DACA recipient, then you cannot. So all of that, of course, can mean that if you are in a high school with a lot of undocumented students and, questioning kind of what their next step is going to be after high school, you can imagine that this probably definitely comes into play in terms of academic performance and assistant and persistence and aspirations. Now, I said that schools have resegregated. They have. And so now we'll be addressing why that's the case. So this just shows you in today's school kind of what the average student school's makeup is by race and ethnicity. And it just shows you that most white students go to schools that are predominantly white. Most Black students are in school that are, predominantly Black and Latino and Asian. And so what really, I feel like this graph doesn't make much sense unless you have a way of comparing it maybe to what it was. And so what we have here is a graph specifically focusing on African American and Latino children over time. We have the late 1960s, the early 1980s, the mid 1990s, the early aughts, and then 2010. And they're breaking it down based on whether or not they are in segregated schools or hyper-segregated schools, what they call intensely segregated. Intensely segregated schools is when your school is 90% non-white. And so you can see that in the late 1960s, a lot of African Americans, 64% of them were in schools that were, intensely segregated. And that's not surprising given how very slow both the South and the non-South were to embrace desegregation. And Latinos were in schools that were 54% were in segregated schools, and 23% of those were in hyper-segregated schools. In the 1980s, we see these numbers for African Americans go down in particular, and this is during busing. They continue to go down in 1990s, and then they go up in the 2000s, and then by the end, we are, if you're just talking about segregation and not hyper-segregation, they're back at schools that are just as segregated almost as in the 1960s. And what we see with Latinos is even worse because they steadily go up throughout. And so why? What's going on that's encouraging this resegregation? And a lot of this is de facto segregation, obviously. This is not de jure. But because we have in this country this race-class conflation, and that's a term that you hopefully remember from your race and ethnicity chapter, but oftentimes racial minorities, particularly Native Americans, Latinos, and African Americans, are much more likely to be poor, working poor. And so they live in areas that are both poor as well as not racially mixed, racially segregated. And so what happens is these students, they attend schools based on where they live, and where they live is often related to both their race and their socioeconomic status. So their schools wind up being largely poor and largely minority. And because we've backed away from busing and that actually was a Supreme Court case that came out of North Carolina, Swan versus Charlotte Meck, in the late I think it was the 1980s. What happened when we stopped busing children outside of their neighborhood and their neighborhood schools is schools experienced a pattern of segregation, desegregation, and now resegregation. And this resegregation pattern, like I said, it's not just because it's racially resegregated, but oftentimes it's because these schools are significantly poorer as well. Because when you are pulling just from your local population, this usually impacts the amount of funding available to your school. And so you wind up with some schools that are have a much higher percentage of low-income students than other schools within the same state, within the same city. And how is that the case? Well, it has a lot to do with how we finance schools. Most of the schools' finances come from the state and the local level. Different states use different equations where some rely much more on the state and some rely much more on local level. But those are the two primary levels that school financing comes from. At the state level, it comes from, of course, taxes, that the states give money to the schools, and how much money they give, you don't have to worry too much about this, but how much money they give varies by the state. Some states embrace equalization policies where they try to give money to schools so that the low property districts have access to at least a basic minimum level of funding for their schools. So they're at least trying to bring them up to a certain basic minimum. And then they give wealthy districts less money because they're already at that basic minimum. But some states don't have these equalization policies, and instead they might base their allotment on average daily attendance rate, or just a flat rate per pupil expenditure. And there are issues with both. Oftentimes, lower income schools are more likely to have issues with truancy and dropouts, and both of those things would affect their ADA or their flat rate per pupil expenditure. From the local level, for areas that public schools are financed by local taxes, a lot of that, of course, comes from property tax. So if you're in an area where everyone has a nice home, a McMansion, owns their own property, then your school is usually going to reflect that. If you live in an area where no one owns their home, everyone rents, or the homes themselves are not very nice, then that's going to impact the amount of funding that your school is able to get from that type of tax. And of course, with states varying in, how they pay for the schools themselves, unsurprisingly, of course, teacher pay is going to vary as well. And teacher pay oftentimes comes up because, people believe there is this relationship between better paid teachers are better teachers. And although that relationship doesn't really hold up statistically, what we do know is better paid teachers uh, are less likely to leave the job early. They're less likely to have to work a second job. They do have a higher level of job commitment. And so those types of things can contribute to them being, if not better teachers, at least more stable teachers. And this is really important because a lot of areas, especially those with low paying for that area teacher positions, have teacher vacancies. They have issues not finding enough teachers. And of course, this is a problem because if you don't have enough teachers to teach your students, your classes are overcrowded, and that can impact the quality of education. You have to rely on subs, and that can impact academic performance and quality of education. So funding and how funding can vary between different school systems by state, by county, by school within the county, is really key. Is a really key concern when we talk about problems in the U.S. school system. Oftentimes, people feel like that the federal government has a much bigger role in educational funding than they do. But the federal government doesn't really have a big role. They provide assistance to states and schools in an effort to supplement, not supplant, state support. That's really the best way to put it. So they give states and they give schools money for specific programs. And some of those programs are based on, how many of these types of students are in your school, which means there are some schools that receive very little federal level. Maybe the best known of the federal level programs is Title I, because it's the one that it A school has Title I designation based on the percentage of their students that qualify for free or reduced lunch. So basically, if your school has a certain percentage of low income students, you receive additional money from the government. And this is somewhat meant to account for the fact that you probably are not receiving a lot of local level funds. And it's meant to provide more resources to these high poverty schools. Other types of programs that we've had in the past is like our English language acquisition programs. Before we switched to Common Core, there were a lot of programs related to No Child Left Behind, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which we'll talk a little bit more about, called IDEA. There's specific funds that the federal government gives so that schools have the ability to uphold students' IEPs. As I indicated when I talked about free and reduced lunch, that comes from the federal government. It's actually run by the USDA. And it provides low cost or free lunches, as well as snacks and after school, before school care enrichment programs to, like I said, students who qualify. But the big takeaway is that the bulk of school financing does not come from the federal level of government. It comes from either a combination of the state and the local. So a lot of schools, of course, are always struggling with money, and they, look to other ways to raise funds. So how do they do that? Well, there's school booster clubs and PTAs, Parent Teacher Association fundraisers, donations from parents and community. Teachers themselves oftentimes come out of pocket. Um, you know, One thing I always like for students to consider is the problem with relying on these types of funds is usually the schools that are most disadvantaged, because they are lower income schools. This is just a way in which higher income schools make even more money than these schools, because their PTA fundraisers and school booster clubs and donations from parents and community oftentimes greatly outpace what lower income parents and community members can do. And for a good example of this, I show you a graphic from San Francisco United, where the top 10 PTAs in that year raised $2.77 million. Then the next 26 schools raised a combined 2.55 million. And then there were 35 schools that they raised no significant fundraising, so less than $1,500. And you can imagine a lot of those were probably already the poorer schools. So you have schools that already are advantaged in terms of their funding, and then they're able to raise even more money through these kind of extra ways of fundraising, and so in this way their advantages and their resources, whether it's better paid teachers or newer technology or nicer grounds or more clubs, right, whatever it is that the money is going to, they're able to stack these advantages even further. And so, as we kind of move, away from this topic about, how equal is our public education, I really just would like to point out that, while oftentimes this can become a discussion about race, it's really more about income. Keep in mind, like I said, there is this race class conflation, so that a lot of schools that have a lot of minorities, particularly Native Americans, African Americans, and Latinos, it is not so much that they have so many minority students, they have so many poor students that contribute to these academic performance issues. And part of how we know this is when we look at some of our underperforming schools through just the lens specifically of income and not just solely race, we see that, and this is a graph that looks at the percentage of students that go on to, in different types of schools, that go on to, complete a 4-year degree in 6 years. You can see that one of the lowest schools for the low income schools is schools that are low minority rural. in which case only 44% of their students, go on to finish a college degree. Um, and you want to think about this being like Appalachia, like West Virginia and Kentucky, right? And at that point it's the income more so than the minority status, because it's worth noting that higher income schools, even if they're high minority, um, they all have much stronger outcomes than lower income schools, regardless of the level of minority students who are in these schools. um, and so all of this, of course, just kind of complicates, our discussion around, how equitable is this public education. Now, one thing that oftentimes comes up is that some of what we're seeing are the effects of home, not just the effects of education. Um, and people that are really interested in the effects of home, the question they often raise is, could equality of education ever make up for inequality of condition? If people come to school with, this deficiency in their home life resources, is there anything that schools can really do to address that? And so, what is this relationship between home and school? Well, one thing that we can discuss or think about is the fact that the difference in what we call cultural capital. The differences in the home life of rich and poor children is a major factor in education, and families with more income are able to give their children more cultural capital, the cultural experiences that carry status and have value in larger society. Going to museums, reading books, watching the news. They oftentimes just have a more conducive environment of providing this type of capital because they themselves are educated. And in this way, we even know that even though I'm talking about this in terms of rich homes versus poor homes, it really is more related to parental education than it necessarily even is to parental income. It's just because of the relationship between income and education, oftentimes we're talking about the same people. Low income students, as I've noted, they have a double disadvantage because they have a lack of resources at home, but usually because of the types of neighborhoods that they live in and that they attend neighborhood schools, they also have a lack of resources in schools. And so there's this learning gap between high income and low income students. It starts early. Um, and and it becomes a hard gap to close. It oftentimes becomes greater during the summer months, um, as schooling learning is not being supported during the summer months in the same way that it might be in homes where maybe parents can afford to invest in enrichment activities. And so research certainly suggests that while schools matter, education at home matters more. And one uh, kind of strand of this research has especially focused on early childhood education, because there's growing concern about what they call like the uh, vocabulary gap that exists between poor children and wealthier children. And there's certain evidence that shows that this gap doesn't get smaller over time. Instead, it just becomes larger. And kind of once it becomes, and if it is a large enough gap, it becomes very hard for it to be diminished um, in those early years of school. And it's this argument that has led some states, like California, for instance, to consider making pre-K compulsory, because perhaps even at the age of 5, getting children in kindergarten at the age of 5, perhaps even then it's already maybe a little too late to address some of these deficiencies. For the rest of this video, I'm going to, because the primary problems with the US school system, as I noted in video 1, really are problems associated with uh, equitable education, unequal educational opportunities. And we've kind of discussed that from a class, a race, uh, funding standpoint. But there are other types of problems that exist um, in the U.S. school system, and one way we can think about those is these problems exist within schools, not between schools. So these are the types of problems that can exist at all schools in certain extents and impact different segments of that school's population differently. So beginning with dropping out. So dropping out, uh, we have uh, greatly improved our dropout rate in the last 50, 60 years. In 1960 the rate was 14%, and in 2016 it was 6%. So obviously we have decreased it by over half. There are racial distinctions, with Native Americans and Hispanics being much more likely than non-Hispanic whites and even African Americans to dropping out. Dropping out is oftentimes related to being both economically as well as culturally disadvantaged, um, for both Native Americans as well as Hispanics, particularly if they're not documented. There's oftentimes um, less certainty around post secondary educational opportunities and more pressure to economically contribute to their families. And that has certainly that contributes to those racial distinctions. Of course, as a country, we're concerned about dropping out because it puts one at risk for other social problems, uh, poverty, unemployment, underemployment, lack of healthcare access. There is, increased risk of incarceration. So, there have been many campaigns to try to keep students in school for as long as possible. And there have been some states that have raised their dropout age to 18 as a way to just largely prevent students from dropping out at all. Another problem that we see within schools is tracking. Tracking is a policy of assigning students to different educational programs. Supporters say grouping students by abilities will help all succeed. Critics say tracking is just a form of institutional discrimination. Um, and tracks can be based both around deficiencies as well as gifts. So, if you are in a academically gifted program, that is what is an example of what's meant by tracking. Um, Oftentimes one of the main issues with tracking programs is placement within these programs is rarely done objectively. There are students who are not given access to especially gifted programs when their grades and test scores suggest that they should be, and there are students who are given access to such programs when there is no objective criteria that suggests that they belong in that program. And that's important because it can become, according to labeling theorists, a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? If you define people in a certain way, they eventually think and act as if the definition were true. And if we're talking about the label gifted, this might be a really good thing that students think of themselves as being special, gifted, and talented, and that other people perceive them as much. But if you think about maybe students that are placed in like the slow learners track or whatever kind of euphemism people in school might have for that type of track, just think about what it means if a student kind of absorbs that label, thinks of themselves as being slow or not a good learner. And so this is part of why the process or the practice of tracking can be controversial. I've already mentioned briefly IDEA. In 1975, Congress passed the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, now known as the Individuals and Disabilities Education Act. In the same way that there is a debate about how do you best serve your ESL students, there is a debate about how do you best serve your students that have a disability. with some people arguing that mainstreaming, where you integrate them into the overall educational program, is better, while some people arguing for special education, which places children in separate classes with specially trained teachers. What has become more common is that students maybe have a mix of both, as well as other resources, as the latest revision of IDEA emphasize the importance of all students who have disabilities having what is called an IEP, an individualized education plan. Because these plans sometimes involve resources that the schools themselves don't have. As I noted, this is one area in which the federal government will provide funding to schools in order to help them to be able to address the needs of their students who have IEPs. And now for the kind of final problem that I'm going to discuss with the US school system, and that's related to violence. School violence in this era of our concerns around, mass shootings has become a growing concern. And it's worth noting that when we use the term school violence, we're not just talking about a specific type of violence. It includes homicides, but it also includes aggravated assaults. It includes rape. 69% of public schools report at least one violent crime at school during the 2015-2016 school year. Maybe unsurprisingly, larger schools are more likely to have violence. Also, urban and suburban schools are more likely to have violence than rural schools. Even though a specific form of violence, school shootings, which of course, just kind of occupy a lot of our kind of attention and concern, they themselves are rare compared to other forms of violence. They're not as rare as they were like 20, 30 years ago, but violence itself, right, moving beyond just school shootings to just talking about all violence. Violence itself in schools has actually fallen from 53 incidents to 18 incidents per 1,000 students. And that was between 1992 and 2016. And a lot of that has to do with kind of the declining significance and presence of gangs, especially in urban and suburban schools, as they've been able to kind of get gang activity under control in a lot of school systems and areas. A lot of the violence that we saw in the late 80s, early 90s in schools, a lot of that has declined. And part of how schools address it have been zero tolerance policies, dress codes, as well as conflict resolution problems. Heightened security, bringing in school resource officers. All of those have been ways of trying to address violence. Of course, because these types of violent incidences do still exist, and certainly the fear that people have around things like school shootings, that perception of fear, of being fearful of violence, violent occurrences within schools does exist and is a concern for a lot of students as well as their parents. So just because this decline has happened doesn't mean that it's necessarily shifted people's perceptions on how they view this problem. And that is it. So for the third video, I'm going to be kind of trying to tie a lot of this up and address this question about inequality of opportunity, inequality of education. And in that third video, I also will be talking about the theoretical frameworks and the political ideologies.